Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports, History, and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Michael Bender, the author of Frankly, We Did Win This Election, the inside story of how Trump lost. The author of this New York Times bestseller is also the senior White House correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Thanks so much for being here, Mr. Bender.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Before we start our interview, I do want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. On the early morning of November 9th, 2016, Donald Trump emerged at Trump Tower to claim victory. The first time politician had beaten someone who had been preparing to be president for 2 decades. Donald Trump had figured out a winning formula in states the Republicans had not succeeded in generations. 4 years ago, 4 years later, 2 impeachments, 25,000 tweets. On the early morning of November 4th, 2020, he emerged at the White House to say the same thing, that he'd won. But he hadn't. Michael Bender's book explores how the winning formula broke down in the last year of the Trump presidency. Michael, when you heard, frankly, we did win this election, did you know that would be the title of your book?
I actually thought that it might be. I thought it would be a good sort of encapsulation of everything we saw in 2020, which was sort of a president desperate to hold on to power, desperate to hold on to office, and his willingness to go to extraordinary lengths to impose his own reality on that situation. So I thought it might be. I wanted the book to be an interesting read. I wanted it to be we all know the sort of story of the Trump chaos, and I didn't want this to be another just simply Trump chaos book. I wanted to give people a reason to turn the page, and that had that sort of intriguing kind of twist as a potentially very interesting title, and it ended up being what I used. So yeah.
It's easy to forget that the president was riding high in early 2020 with all that 2020 brought. His approval was as high as it had ever been. I went back and looked, and it was just under 50%, which was about as high as it had been. He'd gotten tough with Iran. The economy was pretty okay. His challengers were all over the map. The Democrats were a herd of cats. There was an impeachment that the president's team thought would make him stronger. So set the stage for us. How confident was the president in January based on your reporting with the Wall Street Journal?
Oh, he was sky high. I mean, the whole team was. Like you said, he wanted to run on the economy. It was cooking. The impeachment, he'd been acquitted. He not only survived, but he was thriving. And it had supercharged his own fundraising with his supporters. It had turned a lot of independents and moderates against Democrats. At that point, they were blaming Democrats for kind of wasting their time with all of these Ukrainian names they couldn't really, had never heard of, couldn't pronounce, and wasn't quite clear that it was cut and dry and impeachable offense. I have a scene in the book in February, where Trump is speaking to reporters on Air Force One and is in the president's cabin. And the other thing that's happening at the same time is that Michael Bloomberg is melting down in the Democratic primary. He's on stage in a debate with Democrats and gets just eviscerated by Elizabeth Warren. And Trump is now, just absolutely giddy and calls the press corps into the cabin at the front of Air Force One, which is pretty unheard of before Trump took office.
And you've flown on Air Force One a number of times, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And starts giving reporters a kind of play-by-play color commentary of the Democratic primary, and making sure that the flight attendants are bringing in, pretzels and chips and different, hors d'oeuvres to so that the press corps, the so-called fake news, can settle in and enjoy the scene with him. So he was, sends reporters off at that point and says, I'm going to win. You're seeing it now. This is I'm going to be president again.
Did he have a certain political touch that you observed that was underestimated? It kind of reminds me of George W. Bush a little bit. Don't
Mm-hmm.
misunderestimate me. Is that
Mm-hmm.
what you found in your years of covering Donald Trump, that he sort of really understood where the political openings were better than his opponents realized he did?
Yeah, I mean, Trump's abilities certainly matched the moment here, right? Looking for, at a time when the American electorate was looking for an outsider, when they patience and trust in institutions was at an all-time low. Here comes someone like Donald Trump, who has been, he's a gift for communications. No matter what you think about him, or what you think he's saying, or how he uses it, that he's sharpened over years, and he's come up in the New York tabloid culture. And by the time 2016 rolls around, and certainly displays this through 2020, has sort of a gift for communicating, is speaking in a kind of imprecise way that anyone can kind of hear what they want to hear from him. If you are against Trump, you can hear him say, he can utter the sort of same sentence where his opponents will say, see, this is why he's unfit for office. But at the same time, his supporters say, this is why. This is exactly why we want him in the job. So, I think that was definitely a gift of his.
Yeah, and you can sort of get the gist of what he's saying. One of the reasons the president was so confident, and this is something that I observed early on covering his early rallies in Florida. I observed maybe, I don't know, a half dozen of them even before he was president. One of the reasons he was so confident is that he was not only surrounded by deferential advisors who gave him flattering information, but the rallies. The rallies featured tens of thousands of people. They clapped at the same speed and at the same
Mm-hmm.
volume, almost no matter what he said. Most
Mm-hmm.
presidential addresses will go up and down, and there's a funny line maybe, and then there's a serious moment. But the Trump rallies are like the same rhythm, the same level of applause all the way through. Cracking down on China, low flow shower heads.
Mm-hmm.
They all elicited the same response. You profile, and this is one of my favorite parts of your book, one of the sort of motifs of the book is the front row Joes.
Mm-hmm.
They wait for days and days to see him. And I've talked to several members of them over the time that
Mm-hmm.
I covered Trump rallies. And explain the devotion that his most loyal followers had to him, and why you felt that this was an important insight into Trump's political sensibilities. In other words, why they represented that the media just couldn't gauge the support that Donald Trump would have in 2016 and then again in 2020.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is, I mentioned earlier, is trying to give people something. There's a whole pantheon, libraries full of Trump books written over the decades, and I wanted to give people a reason to read this one, to buy this one, to read this one. And I think that we have a lot of new reporting in here from what was happening behind the scenes when it came to COVID and George Floyd, and a lot of unreported scenes inside the campaign under the hood of that $2 billion operation, with exclusive memos and text messages that start to explain some of the decisions that were being made over there. But the third piece is the front row Joes here. I don't think that anyone has spent the kind of time with Trump supporters that I have. I effectively embedded for 2 years with the folks who go to, rally after rally after rally. And these are people who have been to 30, 40, 50, in some cases 60 Trump rallies over the past 5 years. And kind of what I found here was that, that they had found a sort of sense of community. I mean, these were people who are, recently retired or on the verge of retirement, maybe didn't have kids or estranged from their kids, time on their hands, right? And they were going to these rallies that they were drawn by Trump's status as an outsider candidate. They liked what they had seen either on The Apprentice or him in the New York tabloids, him as a New York builder, businessman, or the the Trump brand itself. and then started finding each other, started seeing the same people at these rallies, and formed this kind of community where they would stay at each other's houses when they were traveling on the road, or maybe split a hotel room or carpool. A couple of people met and divorced uh, because of Trump rallies, and in a way, Trump had made their lives richer, bigger, fuller. One of the rally goers who I spent a lot of time with in the book is a woman by the name of Sandra Kaczynski. She, by the end of 2020, she's frequent flyer status on Delta, I think it is, one of the airlines, where she's standing in. Most of us, spent most of 2020 in my house, let alone traveling on airplanes, and she earns enough miles to earn first class status, and has to ask the flight attendant what it means when they tell her she's become silver, preferred, platinum, or whatever it was. I think one thing I do try to do is through the book is kind of show how these folks are ultimately misled, that whether it's COVID or the election results of 2020, that the person that they put their trust in here, it doesn't level with them when it comes to the severity of COVID early on, and certainly doesn't level with them at the end about what the actual election results are in 2020, and it has some real consequences, not for just the country, but for them personally.
Yeah, I remember talking to people who were waiting, I guess probably about a day and a half before a rally here in Tampa, where I live and work. And I spoke to a couple people who may qualify as front row Joes. They were there a day and a half early.
Mm-hmm.
And they were, this was just before the election, and they were confident that it had already been stolen, that there was nothing that anyone could do. This is apparently the last few days I'm going to get to see him as my president, and that's why I'm here.
Yeah, Trump had been promising just that to us for years, right? I mean, in a way, like I spend some of the end of the book here talking about how the people around Trump, there's a real failure of imagination, and from the people closest to Trump and his advisors in those last couple of months, to not realize that exactly where this was going. I mean, there was, almost to a person, everyone thought that Trump was going to kind of find his own way to a concession, maybe not a traditional concession, but to find some way to give a wink and a nod to everybody that he'd lost. But the reality is, that just he spent 4 years as president telling us, no other politicians were to be trusted. The courts were wrong, and that the media was always lying. And it's true. It goes back even further than that. It's an Emmy that The Apprentice didn't get, I think, an Academy Award, or one of these TV awards that he did not win, and accused the Academy of election fraud, because of the other show that got it. I mean, so this is a tried and true pattern from Trump for not just years but decades.
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware, and there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Let's talk about how things start to come crashing down. He, as you mentioned, was riding high. The polls look good for him. The Democrats were in disarray. February 25th, there's a press conference. Health officials say it's not a matter of if this pandemic is going to be the real deal, but when. Mm-hmm. The stock market falls, and I have this vivid imagery in my head that you described of the president being on Air Force One and not being able to sleep all the way back. Describe that scene, but also what early decisions were made in the political response that would foreshadow the way the virus would be handled over the next year.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of the where his world sort of where the carpet starts getting pulled out from under his feet with regards to not just 2020, the year it was, but also his reelection. He'd been essentially feted for 2 days in India. I was on this trip, and it was an incredible display of what he would describe as love. I mean, there was the largest political rally ever held in an outdoor cricket stadium in India that they had rushed to finish building, and in some cases still building while he was still there. People lined streets miles and miles, thousands of people waving signs and dancing and all this a big dinner. And again, coming at the tail end of the sort of democratic disarray in that race.
And just briefly, was it true adoration or was it show? What was it done to flatter?
It was probably a little of both. I mean, it certainly was some show. I mean, Modi wanted a big show of adoration, right? And he had made sure that people were. There were some stories in the press at the time about how the things that were going on behind the scenes that he was doing to make sure that stadium was full, to make sure that there was people 2, 3, 4 deep along the sides of the street when the motorcade was driving by. They had built a wall to hide some of the slums that the motorcade was going to be driving by. So yeah, that was definitely a big part of it. And then, as you say,
the early decisions, yeah,
and there are signs of COVID's menace. Certainly in China at that point, it had been a couple of months, and Trump had been sort of dismissive of it so far. The flight back from India, where the CDC has a press conference, as you said, and stock market tanks on that news, and basically everyone around Trump has exhausted from the trip, falls asleep on the flight except for him and a couple of other people. And he doesn't even sleep when he gets home, comes back to Washington, goes to the White House, has a news conference that day to start downplaying the severity of the virus. And this is where we see the beginnings of Trump's political approach to this, which is he will say, he says later in the year, and if you ask him now, that he was concerned about a panic, that he didn't want to panic people. And I think there's certainly a certain amount of truth to that had he come out, or anyone come out and said this is a pandemic right away, or that this is going to be devastating, like people would have lost their minds. But instead of educating people about what this might look like, or what doctors did know about it, or what the top public health officials in the administration were thinking about it, to start to bring the public along, he effectively denies it and says it's going away. There's only a couple
like
of
a
people.
Miracle.
Yeah, I mean, this is where some of those lines, start to pick up, and it's going to go away. That there's going to he starts talking about not wanting cruise ships to dock in the country because he's worried about the COVID numbers increasing, and where it just starts to become very, very clear that he's it's going to be a purely political response from him. And there is and that's sort of the part of the tragedy of Trump in 2020 is no one initially here blames Trump for COVID, right? I mean, it's not his fault that there's a pandemic, but like any, just in the same way that no one's going to blame, the governor of Florida or the governor of Louisiana for a hurricane hitting the state, right? But the rub comes in the response and how you respond to it, and the lack of empathy from Trump, and the lack of of honesty, and just seeming purely political, starts to do him in as time goes on.
What did he say? I'm wondering if he ever said any of this to you or to other reporters. What did he say privately about the deaths that were happening? Did he ever indicate to you or to other people around him his innermost feelings on the misery going on out there?
Well, I mean, I think he does say a little bit of this publicly, right? Like even one death is too many, and I don't have any reason to believe any reason to not believe him on when it comes to that. But the issue kind of comes in and when he just makes everything so personal, right? And it's like the act of acknowledging these depths and the severity of it is somehow a reflection on him as president or his abilities as a leader or as a politician. And that's where he starts to distance himself from that instead of trying to embrace some of the the tragedy of it and the difficulty that Americans in every walk of life and every kind of economic station we're dealing with in one way or another, right? I mean, it changed our routines from coast to coast and increased everybody's stress.
We're talking about a period in time that is not that long ago, but it's useful to go back and remember the way things were in that moment and what we were thinking going forward without the benefit of having 15 or 16 months of hindsight now. So explain how much the pandemic changed the president's campaign. The rallies were going to be a big part of it, and they always were, and he loves those rallies. How did the pandemic start to shape the way the political calculations were made and ultimately help lead to, his political demise?
Yeah, I think what it showed was that there was just never, for someone known as a counterpuncher, right? There was never sort of there was never really a counterpunch from the campaign. There was never a readjustment. I would say even the important thing is to take a step even further back. Trump hired a campaign manager in February of 2018. He'd barely been president for a year, and the reelection campaign is underway. So then, by the time February 2020 comes, right, this thing is 2 years in the making, and you can argue that there's certain things that the campaign should have done by then that they didn't. But I think when it's inarguable is that they really struggled. The president and the senior team struggled to readjust.
And they had to cancel the rallies, and they start to make fun of the
Yeah, they have to cancel rallies. They have to find some different way to talk about the economy that was going to be the golden key to the election. And now it's the Great Depression all over again, right? I mean, that's the kind of cliff we saw in the economy, and it wasn't impossible to overcome. In fact, Trump got pretty close to winning a second term, but it took him months and months to find. And I kind of argue in the book here that he never really settled on a single message to sell to voters about why he deserved a second term, whether it was the economy or COVID or anything else.
And when Biden starts to emerge as the Democratic nominee, Trump had identified years before this that Biden would be his biggest threat and maybe his only threat. How did they start to focus on Biden? You write a lot in the book about this, well, maybe we could try this, maybe we could try that. This isn't quite working. Maybe we should change the types of pictures that we're using of him to make him appear older. Trump was angry, who's of course always so concerned about the visual element, and to some success. Trump wants them to use pictures to make him seem old. And then there was this quote, I think it was, I forget who said it, so I'll let you say who said it, but there was this quote that said, should they hit the Mick? Kind of a vulgar way of saying, and I excuse me for using that word, but it's in the book. And so explain the calculations they're making on Biden as he's emerging as the nominee.
Yeah, I think this is a good way to sort of illustrate the point I was just trying to make, is that he just can't get his mind around what the messaging should be when it comes to any of the issues, and Biden in particular. You're right. I mean, polling had showed for years and then months in 2022 before Biden was the nominee that he would be the toughest to beat. But Trump has just sort of decided that somewhere along the line that Biden isn't that tough, and that is in fact is a weak candidate. And he said it publicly, all the stuff about questioning his mental faculties, whether it's not all there, right? I mean, I have in the book that privately in the Oval Office during, an unrelated policy meeting, he just sort of wonders out loud how he can be losing in the polls to a quote unquote mental retard, right? I mean, which I repeat here because, again, to show just how the difficulty Trump has in settling on the idea that this is going to be his opponent, that he needs to take him on. I mean, the kind of calling card of Trump politically is his ability to kind of devastate an opponent with a nickname, Sleepy,
Crooked Hillary.
Yeah,
Crooked Hillary, Little Marco, Lion Ted.
Right, Jeb's low energy. And when it comes to Biden, so a couple things on Biden. One is that he ends up using a couple dozen different nicknames for Biden. And the first and one that probably most people know is Sleepy Joe, which, even early on, people around him, some of his advisors, wondered about the wisdom of that it was sort of sounded like your, sort of sleepy old uncle. You would fall asleep at the kitchen table during Thanksgiving dinner. And, in a year like 2020 and a presidency like Trump's, like, there was sort of an appeal to that. It wasn't devastating. It was sort of appealing, the idea of that you weren't going to hear from the president you could hear from the president every hour of the day. So he goes back and forth on some of this stuff. And, his campaign, meanwhile, is split. Brad Parscale was still the campaign manager, even during, and it was early months of COVID. Parscale wants to, kind of open up the floodgates and turn all of the weapons of the campaign and the resources of the campaign and just to devastate Biden and try to drive his approval ratings just through the floor, under the theory that he didn't have, initially Biden didn't really have any money. He had to sort of make all that up, and that he wouldn't be able to counter, that he wouldn't be, and that he wouldn't be able to recover. Maybe that doesn't happen because, for one reason, as you say, like, Trump can't really pull a trigger on any of the ads because he disappears in the details when Trump isn't. He has a tendency to kind of micromanage to the point of kind of missing the trees here. I have a scene where COVID's happening, and he's showing people at Mar-a-Lago the edits he has on the Republican National Convention logo, that it should be 5 stars around the elephant instead of 4 because of a 5-star hotel, and that sort of thing. And Brad comes and tells Trump, like, we need to hit the MIC, meaning we need to go after Biden. But there was another camp, this one led by Kellyanne Conway, that said, no, this is a pandemic, it's COVID. We need to politic by showing our advantage, which is the podium, that Trump needs to go out, be a leader on COVID, and people aren't going to have an appetite for negative campaign ads, but they are going to have an appetite for hearing something direct and reassuring about an unknown virus. And there's merits to both. And Trump kind of picks the middle. He initially holds off on an attack, and then kind of approves it just like a month or so later, when it becomes clear that his COVID news conferences aren't having quite the effect that he wanted.
And he bragged about the ratings, best ratings in the world. There was tremendous energy in the country in 2020, particularly in late May and early June. The George Floyd video gets out. How did the president react when he saw the video, and how did the campaign react to this new energy that was sweeping the nation?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this was another sort of big inflection point for not just the country, but Trump and his reelection chances too. I mean, initially, I report for the first time in the book and have some pretty detailed scenes about this. Is that Trump is distraught about what he sees in the George Floyd video. He's taken aback. He's disturbed, like so many Americans were after watching that. I mean, I should sort of caveat that by saying that it did take Trump a couple of days before he watched the video, and he never actually watches the full thing. He turns it off halfway. I mean, he knows how it ends, and it becomes too much for him. And and he starts telling people that how awful it was, and that his family needs justice, and and he's seen cops like that, right? That he's from Queens, and he's heard about these kinds of things before. And there's a moment early on where some of the White House, Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump are pushing for a softer response from Trump, this sort of, justice for the family, reach out to the family. But it doesn't take long that, again, to get back to an earlier point, I mean, Trump personalizes these protests. He sees these protests erupting around the country, and his attention goes to why they're embarrassing him like this, right? I mean, in his mind, he'd been talked into criminal justice reform, supporting criminal justice reforms after a very George Wallace-esque law and order campaign in 2016. Jared Kushner gets him to endorse and support criminal justice reform laws, which he does. Trump does. There's other things that would appeal to Black Americans. Trump codifies millions of dollars for historically Black colleges and universities, money that these schools had to fight for years, which is great, all fine and good. But Trump used that as, okay, I did these things, therefore, Black voters should like me and not criticize me. And as these protests are going on, I detail in the book here, he says, to some people like, they're never going to vote for me. They all hate me. I did all these things for the Blacks, and this is what I get, right? I mean, once you understand that, you can start to understand his response and why it becomes so violent. Really, is that he views this as an affront to him instead of a reaction to decades of racial injustice in the country.
How did the march across Lafayette Square to the church happen? And I have to say, this is probably my favorite scene in the book is what happened after it, and how the president tried to kind of dispatch his aides to calm this whole thing down. But just explain the moment where this is when, of course, the president walks across and holds up the Bible, and they clear the square. So anyway, explain what was going on in the White House, the deliberations that were happening, and then the reaction to the reaction afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, this is really with the point where the Trump White House becomes completely insular for the rest of the year. It's June 1. Floyd had been killed a few days earlier. The protests had enveloped Washington as well as other cities, had gotten close to the White House. We'd find out a few days later that Trump had gone down to the bunker, a secure bunker below the White House, because Secret Service had deemed the protest enough of a threat that that Trump needed to go to the place where where presidents had gone before in real moments of national security emergencies. And that morning, Trump summons his military team, his national security team, and tells them, and then the discussion quickly turns to the Insurrection Act, and Trump gets behind this idea of deploying active duty troops in major American cities. And it's a very, very heated meeting with Trump and Stephen Miller and on one side, and General Mark Milley, Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense at the time, and Attorney General Bill Barr on the other side. And it, kind of fast forward a little bit, everyone kind of goes to their corners. Milley and Barr are back at the FBI headquarters in Washington, not headquarters, excuse me, one of the FBI outposts in Washington, where it's sort of a command post for the protests. And I detail in the book for the first time how it was kind of on a whim, on a lark, that they end up back at the White House. Their communication system goes down for a minute at the FBI, that they're monitoring the protest. Barr had wanted to go back and see how the perimeter was being pushed back. It was supposed to be pushed back away from the White House, past the square, past St. John's Church, earlier in the day. He thought it was happening earlier in the day. Mark Milley, he's wearing fatigues, had planned to go and visit some of the National Guardsmen who were in the area on duty to tell them what their responsibilities were to protect the First Amendment, and to remind them of that, and their kind of quasi law enforcement duties. So he decides to go with Barr too, and they get swept up kind of into this last minute decision between Trump and a few close aides to have this display of strength in their mind. They want some image that Trump is not hiding in the bunker, that he's in charge, and they decide to walk across Lafayette Square to St. John's Church, and all these sort of things come together in a way that you really can't make up, and you have one of the really what's going to go down as one of the most sort of devastating political scenarios in modern American political history, of being TV news cameras above in helicopters watching as Mark Milley is on the phone in the middle of Lafayette Square, and peaceful protesters being pushed back in what appears to be nothing more than so that the President of the United States can have a photo op and raise the Bible above his head in front of a church.
I want to get to what you call Hell Week, but June 17th, you get a call. The president's waiting. He did say he loved your hair, and just being able to see it right now, and I'm not one to talk, but it's fabulous. What is it like to get summoned to the White House and to the Oval Office? And just take us through, for most people have not experienced that. So tell us, what's it like?
Yeah, definitely. It's nerve-wracking, right? I mean, I had, it's the President of the United States, and knowing that you're going to have the opportunity to sit across from him one-on-one, and ask any questions is stressful enough, but to have to do it on a moment's notice. I am lucky enough to be surrounded by a very strong collegial professional team at the Wall Street Journal, and as soon as I got the call, I emailed and called all of them and told them what was going on. So they were sending suggested questions and topics as I was sort of racing to get. Again, this is the middle of a pandemic, of lockdowns. I would, who knows? It had been a couple of days since I showered or put on clean clothes, right? Or shaved, and I had to go and do all of that very quickly. And to boot, I have I'm very lucky to be married to the Washington Post bureau chief, Ashley Parker, who's working in the same space, and she drives me to the White House and is also firing potential questions and topics at me in the car.
My wife is a reporter too, so we've had rides like that also.
Yeah, exactly. Ahead, technically a competitor at that point, but
right.
And then I'm still kind of unsure why I've been called to the White House, or what the agenda is. I mean, he does have the Juneteenth rally in a couple of days. Sometimes he likes to do interviews ahead of big rallies to get kind of polished up and that sort of thing. But I come to find out that there really is no agenda, other than he hadn't had a media interview in a while. He decided he wanted to start doing another round of interviews with reporters, and for whatever reason, I was on kind of the tip of his tongue. I mean, I end up getting left, and I get brought to I have to take my COVID test and wait for that to pass. And I detail this pretty to maybe an exhausting degree in the book, and then I get escorted to the Oval Office and effectively left there alone
inside
for 30 minutes. Correct.
Inside, and explain. I mean, what is going through one's mind when you're sitting there in the same room that FDR and JFK and Barack Obama and Ronald Reagan and all these people, Harry Truman, have sat in? What goes through someone's mind sitting there?
It really is an amazing moment. I've been lucky enough to have this job and to have this kind of ability to be in the Oval Office. And so I had been there a few times before then, but I had never been effectively left alone.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a White House photographer that was kind of coming in and out who I'd known from a previous life, and you know, she snapped a couple pictures and said hi, and then it was also, I mean, it was effectively like the Trump world coming in and out. I mean, Dan Scavino kind of glides through, says hello. Mike Pence comes in and says, "Oh, I heard you were here. I wanted to say hi and ask you how Ashley's doing. How's your baby doing? You know, how's the family?" And then you know, and then, you know, so I'm, you know, kind of wondering, you know, do I sit behind the desk and you know, make myself at home?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd recommend against that, but
yeah, I did not do that. I did think of for a second when Pence left, you know, I said, all right, I just wanted to say hi, and I did think about it for a second, saying, you know, thanks for stopping by. Can you shut the door on your way out? But I also did not do that either. And you know, so
that'll be all, sir.
Yeah.
So then we go through there's a Tulsa rally, which you call the last MAGA rally. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here, but this is capped off by the image of the president leaving the helicopter disheveled. We see him walking with the MAGA hat, and he's all sort of half on. He's sort of half dressed. The crowd size was bad. It disappointed the president. People got sick. Someone died. Herman Cain, former Republican candidate for president, dies because of this rally. The president's digital mastery kind of wears off. They got kind of spoofed by a bunch of kids on TikTok, which made the attendance figures seem like they were going to be bigger than they were. But then Hell Week comes, what you call it, that October 7th. The president gets COVID. Then there are these debates that are looming. How did Hell Week go down? And they really just were not able to adjust their strategy as this Hell Week moves on towards Election Day.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the I would start by saying, like, one of the sort of advantages of Trump is, and also what turns out in this case to be a real disadvantage, is his unpredictability and his willingness to, you know, kind of keep a very flat circle around him and be involved in all the decisions. On one hand, that, you know, things can move very fast around Trump, and in a way that they, you know, normally do not in a government bureaucracy. But on the other hand, things can kind of move fast around Trump. And what happens is, you know, there's a Rose Garden ceremony to announce Amy Coney Barrett as his third, incredibly third nominee to the Supreme Court in 4 years. It's out in the Rose Garden. It's an outdoor event. He does have some pictures inside with Barrett and her family. But what happens is the event ends. They go into inside the White House, and Trump turns to some people and says, "Well, invite everybody in, and we're just going to have some pictures. You know, bring everybody back in," and that's what happens. You know, Meadows brings some people in. Barr comes in. You know, and suddenly there's a reception inside for Barrett, and you know, this is where people in the administration, you know, tell me that they're sure that the COVID spread started, that ended up taking out a good chunk of the White House and infecting ultimately the president. Now, in between the Supreme Court nomination and the positive test is the first debate with Biden. And if you pressed me for like one single moment that did in Trump and as for his reelection, I would say it was this debate, and where he comes out and unlike 2016, he has something to lose. Unlike 2016, he comes out in full aggressiveness, but without any of the charm, right? I mean, say what you will about Trump, and I know this isn't really for everybody, certainly, but there was something. I mean, there was something funny. I mean, Trump was funny, right? I mean,
Even Hillary, if I may jump in, but Hillary Clinton even said, when I rewatched the debates, the tapes of the debates with me and him, I found myself watching him more than myself. And that's Hillary Clinton saying that.
Right. And like it wasn't just all pure tech. There was always something that would sort of take a little bit of the edge off, some like joke. I mean, it was mocking, that gave people a little bit of, but what we saw in Cleveland was the attacks without the mocking. He wasn't funny. He wasn't trying to be funny. He was, you know, he was, you know, and I quote in the book from his own aide saying, just an asshole, right? And that's what people really were turned off by. And and it was a couple of days later he tests positive for COVID, which just has this effect of just encapsulating everything all the things that people were unsure or disliked about Trump. And these sort of few days, it just ties it all together. But we were lucky enough to have a poll at the Wall Street Journal in between these 2 days, after the debate, but before the positive test. And it's the only time in 4 years that he's president, and the Wall Street Journal is taking the poll that we see like a very clear dive. And he just doesn't recover from that. And certainly the COVID test doesn't help.
And how close did he get to dying from COVID based on what we know?
I mean, I think there is still more that we do not. I think there's plenty more to that story that we don't know. I do. I also think I gave as full of an accounting as we know so far. And he was extremely sick. I mean, he was, he was taking medicine to be put on that you would take to be put on a ventilator. They were praying for him in the White House. Mark Meadows tells staff to start praying for the president's survival. That's how severe that they thought it was. Inside the administration.
A few more minutes here. Let's get to election night. And I reflect on 2016 versus 2020. It's almost like everything went right for Trump in 2016. The Russian interference, the Comey letter, Hillary's emails. And in 2020, everything sort of goes wrong for him.
Mm-hmm.
If I were at the White House on election night, paint the scene for us.
Mm-hmm.
Was he really unable to understand that he had lost? Is he capable of understanding that mentally? And take us through what we would have seen if we had been there when he says the cover of a book that we're discussing right now. Frankly, we did win this election.
Yeah, I think it was. Listen, even the people around Trump can't answer the question for sure about whether or not he really believes he won, or whether this is all a bit in order to protect the brand. They go back, people who deal with him on a day-to-day basis, back and forth on that very question. So I do think, though, that that night, in the run-up to that night, he was convinced he was going to win. I mean, his own team, their own numbers. Everybody, to be fair, everybody's numbers were off in one way or another in 2020. The predictive modeling and polling and that sort of thing. And Trump's, $2 billion operation was no different. I mean, he was told he was going to win Georgia, by the same margin he did in 2016. He won it by 5 points in 2016. They told him he was going to win it by 4, I believe, in 2020, and
they were confident in Arizona and all these.
Correct. Yeah. That's right. So I mean, these are Trump's his own numbers, right? And the way it starts unfolding in the White House on election night in 2020 is similar to what happened in 2016. He was down, and then he won Florida, and that seemed to shift the momentum, and the path started to diverge a little bit from there. In 2016, he started picking up more states, and in 2020, it wasn't. It was in doubt. I mean, it was in doubt and starting to slip away from him. And it's pandemonium what happens in the White House. I mean, publicly at the party, where all of Trump's administration and friends and campaign staff, lower level staffers were in eating hors d'oeuvres and watching television. Everything seemed fine, but in the upstairs in the residence, it's just it's a scene out of a movie here where everyone is just shouting different things at Trump, from his kids to his advisors to Rudy Giuliani. And at one point, Giuliani tells him to just say he won. Just go out there and tell him and say you won. And even in Trump world, this kind of has the effect of like a record scratching moment where everyone stops and looks at Rudy, and he said, well, what do you mean? How can he possibly say that? Like, what are you seeing that we're not? And the answer was he wasn't seeing anything that they weren't. That Rudy was telling Trump, as he has for the last couple of years, what he wanted to hear, and to go and act like he won, to say that he did. And there's a rush down to the East Room where Trump eventually gives his speech. And one of the more poignant moments for me is Trump's own kind of path from the residence, where he's getting all of his different information and different directions and different advice until he's behind the microphone in the East Room, and he takes the elevator down with Melania and some of his family, and walks across the White House and into these rooms where televisions have been set up for the crowd, where people have been, had now been moved out of these rooms into the East Room. The televisions are still on. There's sort of plates on the table, and Trump kind of stops at each one of these TVs, watching to see if maybe something has changed in the last few minutes since he'd taken a few steps from the last TV, looking at the numbers, and trying to process what is happening here, and how it can possibly be that there's any doubt about a second term. Walks through the kind of like green room, the backstage room, where some of his old advisors are telling him he won and that this is wrong, and then ends up on the catwalk to walk out to the stage in the microphone and blurts out that how well he's done, that they're having a great night, that they're winning the election, and frankly, we did win this election.
He says starts to lay the groundwork for January 6th, when he says something beautiful was stolen from us by very bad people. All right, let's wrap it up here. Would COVID have sunk any president? I mean, let's be honest. The misery that it created, the economic difficulties it led to, this would not have been easy for any president to deal with.
Oh, absolutely not. And I think it's not necessarily a hypothetical. Just look around the rest of the world and other world leaders who are dealing with it at the same time. I mean, no one handled this particularly well. I mean, it was unknown. I mean, we were learning new crazy things. I mean, I remember learning new crazy things about this virus on a daily basis. Like every few days, the world changed again. I mean, I remember exactly where I was when when I read that that one of the side effects from COVID was that affected your sense of taste and smell. And what? Like how it's like out of science fiction here, right? So yeah, I mean, it was inherently a difficult thing. It was the worst pandemic in 100 years, the worst economy in 100 years, and a civil rights uprising, like we hadn't seen in generations, all wrapped up in one. So yeah, it would have been difficult for anyone to handle. But I also think like the American public has a high capacity for forgiveness, and if there was any attempt to at earnestness and seeking their forgiveness and expressing some empathy, I think that would have gone a long way for any president.
Is life at Mar-a-Lago good enough for him, with the adoring people who show up frequently hoping for his endorsement? Is life at Mar-a-Lago good enough for him to preclude him from running again? And you visited with him there. You spoke to him there. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is kind of how I end the book here in a pretty big scene, and with him in Mar-a-Lago and around this adoring crowd and what he's kind of built for himself. I don't think so. I mean, I think this sort of adulation that he gets from his clubs and his club members has pulled him out of the doldrums that he felt after the November 2020, and put him in the position that we see now, which is someone who is very active. I mean, really in an unprecedented way in the past 100 years of White House history, have we ever seen? We've never seen a White House former president, behave like this after
Teddy
2 terms
Roosevelt
or one.
would be the only one. Yeah.
Well, that's what I mean. So now we're talking early 1900s.
Yeah. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, 100 years we haven't seen anything like this, where he's endorsed a few dozen candidates. He's already campaigning for them, and putting his imprint not just on the party but in a way where 2022 is going to be very instructive. And I think it's going to be a very big data point for him when he decides what to do in 2024.
Did he learn enough from his final year, the year you describe in your book, to be a better president?
I think it's a really good question. Would be something that would have to be, he would undoubtedly be asked. And if he were to run for president again, we were, if you recall, in 2020, it was very difficult for him to talk about a second term. He wanted to talk about what happened in the first term and all the success he had. And he struggled to pivot to some vision of what the next term would look like. But yes, now he will face a very pressing question of what a second term would look like, given what we know about 2020.
If you could write a book on someone else's, another president's definitive year, any president, a definitive year, win or lose, how someone won an election or how someone lost an election, who would you pick?
I don't know. It's a really good question. Why don't I answer that by dodging it? I will say by saying that what I'm reading right now is Nixonland, and that is a
great book.
It's not a single year, but it's explaining a particular moment in political history that I am really quite enjoying reading right now. So,
Michael Bender consistently makes sure politicians can't dodge, and we're going to let him dodge on this show. Michael Bender, the author of Frankly, We Did Win This Election, the inside story of how Trump lost. Thanks so much for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Check out that book, his articles in the Wall Street Journal, and his Twitter feed, which is @MichaelC.Bender. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.